At 6:13 a.m. on July 23, 1943, Technical Sergeant Frank Kovacs stood in the maintenance area outside Gela, Sicily, watching Lieutenant Robert Chen climb into Sherman tank number 327. 29 years old, auto mechanic from Detroit before the war, 3 months maintaining Shermans in North Africa. Kovacs knew Chen had maybe 8 hours before his engine seized. The pattern was burned into Kovacs' memory. He'd seen it 17 times. Tank crews roll out for extended operations. Temperature climbs past 100 degrees. Engine compartment hits 210 degrees. Coolant boils off. Gaskets fail. Engine seizes. Tank stops. Crew abandons. German 88mm anti-tank gun finds stationary target. Crew dies. Kovacs' hands were still black with grease from the work he'd done the previous night. Unauthorized work. Work that violated Army Regulation 350-7. Work that could get him 5 years in military prison. His fingers ached from 40 minutes of cutting metal with a hacksaw. The modified engine cowling he'd installed on Chen's tank looked identical to factory equipment. Unless you knew what to look for. Chen completed his walk-around inspection, checked the tracks, checked the 75mm main gun, checked the ammunition load, didn't look closely at the engine cowling, didn't notice the 6 ventilation slots cut into the metal, didn't see the wire mesh screening riveted over each opening. Climbed through the commander's hatch at 6:13. The Wright R-nine 75 radial engine coughed to life. 18 cylinders, 450 horsepower. The sound echoed across the maintenance area. Diesel fuel smell mixed with Sicilian dust and hot metal. The temperature was already 93 degrees. Predicted high, 109 degrees. Kovacs watched Chen's tank roll toward the checkpoint. Watched it join the column of 12 Shermans preparing for the day's operation. Watched it disappear into the morning dust, heading toward German positions 42 kilometers northeast. If Kovacs' calculations were correct, the modification would drop engine temperatures by 23 degrees. If his calculations were wrong, Chen's crew would die in a tank that Kovacs had sabotaged. 5 men, 5 lives. 5 families who would receive telegrams because a mechanic thought he knew better than Chrysler Corporation engineers. Kovacs lit a cigarette. His 7th since dawn. Couldn't sleep last night. Couldn't stop thinking about what he'd done. What happened in the next 9 hours would prove whether desperation was the same thing as innovation. Whether breaking regulations could save lives. Whether one mechanic with a hacksaw could fix what 3,000 miles of bureaucracy couldn't. The 3rd Armored Division had lost 42 Sherman tanks to engine failure in the past 6 weeks. Not combat damage, not track failures, not transmission problems, overheating. Pure mechanical failure caused by a cooling system that couldn't handle Mediterranean summer temperatures. The numbers were brutal and simple. The Wright R-nine 75 radial engine generated enough heat to boil 12 gallons of water in 14 minutes of sustained combat operation. The cooling system had been designed in Detroit, tested in temperate climates, approved for production based on specifications that assumed ambient temperatures of 75 degrees and combat operations lasting no more than 60 minutes. North African reality was different. Ambient temperatures reached 115 degrees. Sicilian July heat averaged 108 degrees. Combat operations lasted 3 to 9 hours. The cooling system wasn't inadequate. It was catastrophically insufficient. Factory specifications said maximum safe operating temperature was 195 degrees Fahrenheit. Combat reality was 220 degrees in the engine compartment after 30 minutes of movement. 230 degrees after 60 minutes. 240 degrees after 90 minutes. At 215 degrees, gaskets began failing. At 230 degrees, coolant boiled off faster than the system could circulate. At 240 degrees, metal components expanded beyond tolerance. Pistons seized. Cylinder heads cracked. Engines died. The cooling system held 12 gallons of coolant. Under combat conditions, the system lost 1 gallon every 22 minutes to evaporation and boil-off. After 2 hours, the system was running at 50% capacity. After 3 hours, critical failure was inevitable. American doctrine acknowledged the problem. Tank commanders received clear orders. Halt every 90 minutes, let engines cool for 20 minutes, resume operations. The doctrine assumed combat was optional, that you could simply stop fighting when the manual said to rest your engine. German panzer commanders had no such limitation. Their Maybach engines handled heat better. Their cooling systems had larger capacity. They could fight for 6 hours without stopping. When American Shermans halted to cool their engines, German panzers kept attacking. The tactical disadvantage was catastrophic. The kill ratio told the story. For every panzer destroyed, Americans lost 3 Shermans. Intelligence analysis showed half those Sherman losses came from tanks that had stopped moving due to engine failure. Stationary tanks were target practice. German 88mm guns could penetrate Sherman armor from 1,200 yards. A tank that couldn't move was a tank that died. 42 tanks in 6 weeks. That was 7 tanks per week. 1 tank per day. Each tank carried a crew of 5. Driver, bow gunner, gunner, loader, commander. 42 tanks meant 210 crew members. Not all of them died. Some escaped when their engines seized. Some made it to cover before German guns found them, but the casualty rate was 63% for crews who abandoned tanks under fire. 210 crew members, 132 casualties. Killed, wounded, captured, or missing. All because the cooling system couldn't handle Sicilian summer. And Kovacs knew how to fix it. The first tank Kovacs lost to overheating was commanded by Sergeant Thomas Martinez. June 4, 1943, outside Bizerte, Tunisia. Martinez was 23 years old, from California. Joined the Army in 41. Trained at Fort Knox. Shipped to North Africa in March 43. 2 months in theater. Good commander. Careful with his crew. Maintained his equipment properly. His tank rolled out at 0700 hours for a patrol northeast of Bizerte. Expected contact with German positions. Intelligence reported marked for panzers in the area. Martinez's orders were simple. Locate German armor, report positions, avoid engagement if possible. Contact came at 10:47 hours. 3 Mark IVs at 900 yards. Martinez's column of 4 Shermans maneuvered for position. The engagement lasted 38 minutes. Running gun battle across 3 kilometers of open terrain. Martinez's tank fired 17 rounds, scored 4 hits, damaged 1 panzer. The other 2 withdrew. But the running fight pushed Martinez's engine to maximum output. Temperature climbed to 230 degrees. Martinez's loader, Private Eddie Rodriguez, passed out from heat exhaustion at 11:18 hours. The temperature inside the tank was 137 degrees. Rodriguez collapsed across the ammunition racks. Martinez's driver, Corporal James Washington, called out the temperature reading. 232 degrees, 234, 236. The engine was screaming, metal expanding, gaskets failing. At 11:23 hours, the engine seized. Catastrophic failure. Piston rod punched through the cylinder block. The tank rolled another 40 feet on momentum, then stopped. Dead in open terrain, 800 yards from German positions. Martinez ordered immediate evacuation. Get Rodriguez out first. The crew had 30 seconds, maybe less. German gunners had already seen the stopped Sherman. Were already ranging their guns. The crew got Rodriguez through the turret hatch, got him to the ground. Martinez and his gunner, Private James O'Connor, were evacuating when the first German round hit. 88mm armor piercing. Struck the turret at 11:24 hours. Penetrated. The shell killed O'Connor instantly. Wounded Martinez with shrapnel and burns. Set the ammunition on fire. The rest of the crew ran. Dragged Rodriguez. Martinez stumbled after them with second-degree burns on his arms and face. The Sherman exploded 45 seconds later. Ammunition cooked off. Turret blew 30 feet into the air. Another Sherman from the column recovered the survivors, brought them back to base. Rodriguez survived this, but was evacuated to hospital in Algiers with heat stroke. O'Connor's body burned in the wreckage. Martinez survived. That evening, Martinez found Kovacs in the maintenance area. His arms were bandaged. His face was blistered. He could barely speak. But he told Kovacs everything. The temperature gauge, the heat inside the tank, Rodriguez passing out, the engine seizing, the 30 seconds they had to escape, O'Connor dying in the turret. Martinez said the temperature gauge hit 230 degrees, said it felt like being inside an oven, said Eddie Rodriguez was unconscious before the engine quit, said they all knew they were dead once the tank stopped moving. Kovacs asked what temperature the gauge showed when they started the engagement. Martinez said 193 degrees, normal operating temperature. Kovacs did the math. 38 minutes of combat. Temperature increased 37 degrees, from 193 to 230. If the temperature had stayed 20 degrees cooler, the engine would have survived. The tank would have kept moving. O'Connor would still be alive. Rodriguez wouldn't be in a hospital in Algiers. 20 degrees. That was the difference between life and death. 20 degrees that the cooling system couldn't provide. But regulations said Kovacs couldn't fix it. Kovacs had identified the cooling problem after 3 weeks in North Africa. May 1943. He'd been tracking engine temperatures across the battalion, recording operating conditions, comparing factory specifications against combat reality. The data was clear. Engine compartment temperatures consistently exceeded design specifications by 20 to 30 degrees. He submitted a formal report to the battalion maintenance officer, Captain William Ashford. 3 pages. Temperature data from 37 tanks. Analysis of cooling system capacity. Recommendation for field modifications to improve ventilation. Ashford's response came back 4 days later. 1 paragraph. Coolant capacity was within specifications. Engine design was approved by Ordnance Department. Modifications required engineering approval from Chrysler Corporation. Chrysler headquarters was in Detroit, Michigan, 3,000 miles from Sicily. Communication lag was minimum 2 weeks for written correspondence. Engineering review process took 4 to 6 weeks. Implementation timeline was unknown. Meanwhile, tanks were seizing daily. Kovacs watched 4 more crews die in June. June 8th, Lieutenant David Park's tank seized near Tebessa. The crew evacuated. German artillery destroyed the abandoned tank. Park and his driver were killed by the artillery strike while running from the vehicle. June 15th, Sergeant Robert Chem's tank seized during withdrawal from Kasserine. The crew abandoned successfully, reached friendly lines. But the tank was captured by German infantry. Intelligence documents were left inside. Maps, radio codes, orders. The intelligence failure compromised 3 battalions' operational plans. June 21st, Lieutenant Michael Santos's tank seized advancing toward Tunis. The crew evacuated. All survived. But the tank blocked the road. The column behind Santos had to stop. Reroute. Lost 40 minutes. A German counterattack hit during the delay. 17 casualties in the stalled column. June 28th, Sergeant Frank Mueller's tank seized outside Palermo. Mechanical failure during approach to German defensive positions. The crew abandoned, made it to cover. But they were 4 kilometers behind enemy lines. Took them 19 hours to walk back. Mueller was captured by German patrol. Spent rest of war as prisoner. 17 tanks lost to overheating by July 1st. Battalion strength was 64 Shermans. 26% losses to a problem Kovacs knew how to fix. But fixing it meant breaking regulations. Breaking regulations meant court-martial. Court-martial meant dishonorable discharge. Possibly 5 years military prison. Not fixing it meant watching more crews die. Meant more Martinez with burned faces. More O'Connors killed in turrets. More Rodriguez's unconscious from heat stroke. The mathematics of conscience were simple. Regulations versus lives. Prison versus corpses. Authorization versus action. Kovacs made his choice. He'd start with 1 tank, Chen's tank. If the modification worked, he'd do more. If it failed, he'd face the consequences alone. On the evening of July 22, 1943, while Chen slept in his barracks preparing for the next day's mission, Kovacs worked alone in the maintenance area with a hacksaw and a plan that violated every regulation in the Army manual. Kovacs had been an auto mechanic for 8 years before the war. Started at 16 in his uncle's garage in Detroit. Learned engine cooling systems on Fords and Chevrolets. Understood airflow, heat dissipation, thermal dynamics. The principles were the same whether you were cooling a civilian sedan or a 33-ton tank. The Sherman's problem wasn't complicated. It was simple physics being ignored by complicated bureaucracy. The engine compartment was an enclosed space. The Wright R-nine 75 generated massive heat. The cooling system circulated liquid through the engine block to absorb that heat. Radiator fans pushed air through the radiator to cool the liquid. But the hot air had nowhere to go. The compartment design trapped heat. Cooling louvers on the engine deck were inadequate. They allowed some airflow, but not enough. Hot air accumulated faster than it could escape. The enclosed space became an oven. Radiator efficiency dropped as ambient temperature in the compartment increased. The cooling system fought itself, tried to cool an engine inside a space that kept getting hotter. The solution was obvious. Increase ventilation. Let hot air escape. Bring cool air in. Improve convection. The engine would still generate the same heat, but the compartment wouldn't trap it. Kovacs had spent 3 weeks in June observing damaged Shermans in the maintenance yard. Tanks hit by German guns, tanks damaged by mines, tanks abandoned with mechanical failures. He studied the engine cowling design, the armor panels that protected the engine compartment, the access hatches, the ventilation louvers. He measured airflow using improvised tools, held strips of cloth near the louvers to see how much air moved. Timed how long it took for the compartment to cool after the engine shut down. Calculated heat dissipation rates based on temperature drops over time. The factory louvers moved approximately 2,000 cubic feet of air per minute. The engine compartment volume was 98 cubic feet. That meant the air cycled 20 times per minute. Sounded adequate. But the hot air from the radiator was being pulled back through the louvers. Recirculating, not exhausting. Kovacs calculated that the compartment needed 3,000 cubic feet per minute to properly exhaust hot air at combat temperatures. 50% more airflow. That required additional ventilation, more openings. Strategically positioned to create airflow patterns that exhausted hot air while bringing in cool air. He sketched designs in a notebook. Tried different configurations. Slots on the sides of the cowling, angled to prevent debris entry, covered with mesh to stop rocks and shrapnel. Positioned low enough to draw cool air but high enough to avoid ground splash. After 2 weeks of calculations, Kovacs had his design. 6 slots per cowling, 4 inches wide, 18 inches long, positioned at 45-degree angles along both sides. Wire mesh screening doubled over for strength. Quarter-inch mesh, small enough to stop debris, but large enough to allow airflow. He estimated the modification would increase airflow by 30%, from 2,000 to 2,600 cubic feet per minute. That should drop compartment temperatures by 20 to 25 degrees, exactly enough to keep engines below critical failure temperature. The modification would take 40 minutes per tank. Required basic tools: hacksaw, drill, rivet gun, wire cutters. Materials cost approximately $14. Wire mesh from salvage, rivets from supply. No special parts. Nothing that would raise questions during inventory. But the modification violated regulations. Army Regulation 350-7 prohibited unauthorized alterations to combat vehicles. Penalty was court-martial under Article 92 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Willful disobedience of regulations. Maximum sentence: 5 years confinement, dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all pay. Kovacs had seen 17 crews die, 17 funerals, 17 letters to families. 17 times he'd signed off on maintenance logs for tanks that later seized and killed their crews. The regulation meant nothing compared to 17 corpses. July 22nd, 1943. 2,300 hours. The maintenance area was quiet. Most of the battalion was sleeping, preparing for operations the next morning. Kovacs worked alone under a single electric light strung from the maintenance tent. Chen's tank sat on the hardstand, number 327 painted on the turret, scheduled for departure at 06:15 hours. 9-hour operation planned. Reconnaissance in force toward Enna. Expected engagement with German positions. High probability of extended combat. Perfect conditions for engine seizure. Kovacs had made his decision that afternoon. He'd modify one tank, Chen's tank. Test the design under real combat conditions. If it worked, he'd do more. If it failed, only one crew would be at risk. He found the materials in the salvage yard. A Sherman that had taken a German 75mm hit to the turret 3 weeks earlier. Total loss. Crew killed, turret destroyed. But the engine cowling was intact. Kovacs pulled it off with a wrench and carried it to his work area. The cowling was heavy. 43 pounds of rolled homogeneous armor. Quarter-inch steel. He laid it across sawhorses, marked 6 cutting lines with chalk, 4 inches wide, 18 inches long, 3 slots per side. Positioned at 45-degree angles, Kovacs picked up the hacksaw. Standard Army issue, carbon steel blade. He'd sharpened it that afternoon, started cutting the first slot at 23:15 hours. The metal fought back. Quarter-inch armor plate wasn't meant to be cut with a hacksaw. The blade bit slowly. Metal shavings fell onto the ground. The cut took 8 minutes. Kovacs' hands cramped. His shoulders ached. He switched hands. Kept cutting. First slot completed at 23:23 hours. 5 more to go. The second slot went faster. 7 minutes. He'd found the rhythm. Let the blade do the work. Don't force it. Steady pressure, long strokes. The metal shavings were warm from friction. They stuck to his sweaty forearms. Third slot at 23:37 hours. Fourth slot at 23:49 hours. His hands were blistering. The old calluses from Detroit didn't protect against military hacksaws and armor plate. He wrapped his hands in shop rags, kept cutting. Fifth slot at 00:03 hours. His thumb was bleeding. The hacksaw had slipped during the cut, caught his thumb on the blade teeth. Blood mixed with metal shavings and sweat. He wiped it on his coveralls. Started the 6th slot. Finished at 00:17 hours. 42 minutes of cutting. 6 slots. Clean edges. Positioned exactly where he'd calculated they should be. Next came the wire mesh. He'd pulled it from a destroyed half-track the previous week. Quarter-inch mesh, steel wire, doubled it over for strength, cut 6 pieces to cover the slots. Each piece 4 inches by 18 inches with half-inch overlap. The rivet gun was loud. Each rivet made a sharp crack that echoed across the maintenance area. Kovacs worried someone would hear, would investigate, would find him modifying a cowling without authorization. But nobody came. The cracks faded into the night sounds. Generators humming, insects buzzing against lights, distant artillery from the front line. He installed the mesh over each slot, 4 rivets per piece, 24 rivets total. The work went quickly, 15 minutes. By 0032 hours, the modification was complete. Kovacs tested the airflow by hand, held his palm near each slot, felt nothing. The cowling wasn't on an engine, but he could visualize the flow. Hot air exhausting through the angled slots, cool air drawing in from the opposite side, convection patterns that would drop the compartment temperature. If his calculations were correct. If the metal didn't crack under thermal stress. If the rivets held under engine vibration. If debris didn't clog the mesh. If a dozen other things he hadn't thought of didn't go wrong. He carried the modified cowling to Chen's tank. Removed the factory cowling, 4 bolts. The original came off easily. Installed the modified version. Same bolt pattern. Perfect fit. At 01:15 hours, Chen's tank had unauthorized ventilation. Kovacs stepped back, looked at his work. The modification was invisible unless you knew what to look for. The slots were positioned low on the cowling, not visible from ground level. The mesh looked like factory screening, standard equipment. Nobody would notice during casual inspection, unless they measured the slots, unless they checked parts against factory specifications, unless they compared the cowling to another tank. Kovacs cleaned up the work area, swept metal shavings into a bucket, hid the damaged cowling behind the salvage pile, washed his hands in the water barrel. The blood from his thumb stained the water pink. He wrapped the cut with medical tape from his kit. By 0200 hours, all evidence was gone, except the modification on tank 327, and the calculations in Kovacs' notebook, and the knowledge that he'd just committed a court-martial offense. He walked to his tent, didn't sleep, sat on his cot watching the tent ceiling, smoked cigarettes, counted the minutes until dawn, until Chen's departure, until Kovacs would find out if desperation was the same thing as engineering. While Kovacs worked on Chen's tank, the battalion continued losing Shermans to overheating. July had been brutal. 4 more tanks seized while Kovacs prepared his modification. July 2nd, Sergeant Paul Anderson's tank seized during the attack on Agrigento. 12 kilometers south of the city. Extended approach march. 3 hours of movement. Temperature hit 233 degrees. Engine failed at 14:20 hours. Crew abandoned under fire. German machine gun positions on the ridge above them. The crew made it 200 yards before the machine guns opened up. Driver Private Timothy Walsh was killed 30 yards from cover. 3 rounds through the chest. The other 4 crew members reached friendly lines. Anderson survived, but was wounded. Shrapnel in his left leg. July 9th. Lieutenant James Mitchell's tank seized near Caltanissetta. Running engagement with German positions on Highway 117. Mitchell's tank was providing covering fire for infantry advance. Temperature climbed to 228 degrees. Engine seized at 10:37 hours. Crew evacuated successfully. But the tank was in the open. German artillery had direct line of sight. 3 rounds, all hits. Tank destroyed, total loss. No casualties, but the division lost a 33-ton fighting vehicle worth $69,000. July 14th, Sergeant Richard Thompson's tank seized during withdrawal from Barra Franca. Temperature reached 235 degrees. Engine failed during movement. Crew escaped. But they couldn't tow the tank. German infantry captured it 3 hours later. Intelligence documents were inside. Maps, radio frequencies, tactical plans. The intelligence compromise forced division to change all radio codes. Delayed operations by 18 hours. July 19th, Lieutenant Robert Hayes's tank seized approaching Enna. Temperature hit 231 degrees. Crew abandoned without casualties. But German demolition team destroyed the tank with explosive charges. Another total loss. Another $69,000 gone because a cooling system couldn't handle Sicilian heat. 4 tanks in 3 weeks. 18 crew members at risk. 3 killed, 2 wounded, 13 survived. 4 tanks destroyed or captured. $276,000 in lost equipment, all preventable with adequate cooling. Battalion Commander Colonel Edward Morrison demanded explanations. Called a meeting July 20th. All company commanders, all maintenance officers. Morrison wanted answers. Why were tanks failing at unacceptable rates? What was being done to prevent failures? Who was responsible? Captain Ashford, the maintenance officer, blamed crews, said they were exceeding recommended cooling intervals, running engines too hard, ignoring temperature gauges, standard operator error. Company commanders blamed maintenance, said cooling systems weren't being properly serviced. Coolant levels were low, radiators were clogged, standard maintenance failure. Morrison blamed both, ordered increased crew discipline. Mandatory cooling stops every 90 minutes, regardless of tactical situation. Ordered improved maintenance procedures, daily coolant checks, weekly radiator inspections. Nobody blamed the design. Nobody acknowledged that the cooling system was fundamentally inadequate for Mediterranean combat. Nobody suggested modifications, because modifications required authorization, and authorization required time. And time meant more tanks would seize, more crews would die. Kovacs sat in the back of the briefing tent during Morrison's meeting. Said nothing. He was an enlisted mechanic, technical sergeant. His job was to maintain equipment, not question design decisions made by Chrysler Corporation engineers in Detroit. But he knew the truth. The cooling system was killing American tank crews. Official doctrine was inadequate. Regulations were preventing solutions. And if Kovacs waited for authorization, Chen's crew would probably die tomorrow. That night, Kovacs modified Chen's tank, violated regulations, committed a court-martial offense, did what he knew needed doing. Morning came at 0530 hours. Kovacs hadn't slept. He walked to the maintenance area at 0600 hours. Chen's tank was already running. Driver Corporal James Washington had started the engine at 0550 hours. Warming up before departure, pre-flight inspection started at 0610 hours. Lieutenant from Battalion Inspection Team. Standard checklist. Track tension. Transmission fluid. Ammunition load. Radio function. Periscopes. Machine guns. Main gun elevation. Turret traverse. Everything on the list. The inspector never looked closely at the engine cowling. Checked that the cowling was secured. Didn't measure the ventilation slots. Didn't notice the mesh screening. Signed off the inspection at 0612 hours. Tank 327 approved for combat operations. Chen climbed in at 0613 hours. His crew followed. Washington in the driver's position. Bow gunner Corporal Thomas Jackson. Gunner Sergeant Robert Miller. Loader Private Michael Torres. 5 men. 5 lives depending on a modification nobody knew existed except Kovacs. Engine noise increased. Chen's voice on the radio net. 327 ready for movement. Column commander acknowledged. Move out at 0615. Kovacs stood at the edge of the maintenance area, watched Chen's tank roll toward the checkpoint, watched it join the column. 12 Shermans, heading northeast on Highway 117 toward Enna, toward German defensive positions, toward 9 hours of combat operations in 109-degree heat. Tank 327 disappeared into the morning dust at 0617 hours. Kovacs lit a cigarette, his 8th since dawn, started walking back to the maintenance tent. He had work to do, other tanks to maintain, but he couldn't focus. He kept checking his watch. 0700 hours. Column should be 15 kilometers out. 0800 hours. 30 kilometers. 0900 hours. Approaching German positions. Expected first contact between 0930 and 1000 hours. Expected casualties. 2 to 4 tanks based on historical patterns. Expected engine failures. 2 to 3 tanks based on July statistics. Expected return time. 1500 to 1600 hours. 8 to 9 hours before Kovacs would know if his modification worked. 8 to 9 hours before he knew if he'd saved Chen's crew or killed them. 8 to 9 hours of waiting while other mechanics worked around him, asking why he was distracted. Kovacs picked up another hacksaw, found another damaged cowling in the salvage yard, started cutting ventilation slots. If Chen survived, other tanks would need the same modification. If Chen died, Kovacs would face court-martial alone. Either way, he couldn't stop now. The blade bit into the metal. Shavings fell. His hands hurt from last night's work. But he kept cutting. Because somewhere 40 kilometers away, Chen's tank was heating up. And Kovacs needed to know if 23 degrees was enough to make the difference between life and death. Chen's column encountered German defensive positions at 0947 hours. 12 kilometers northeast of Caltanissetta. Highway 117 curved through low hills covered with olive groves. German forces had established a defensive line across the highway. 2 Panzer Mark IV tanks, dug-in infantry positions, anti-tank guns positioned on the ridge to the north. Standard engagement protocol. American column spotted German positions at 1,200 yards. Column commander, Captain Douglas Harper, ordered deployment into combat formation. 12 Shermans spread into a wedge, 4 tanks forward, 4 in support, 4 in reserve. Chen's tank was in the forward element, position 4 in the formation. Harper ordered advance. The Shermans accelerated, 23 miles per hour across rough terrain, engines at maximum output. The kind of sustained power that normally pushed temperatures to critical levels within 20 minutes. Chen's gunner, Sergeant Robert Miller, acquired the 1st Panzer at 900 yards. Chen gave the fire command. Miller fired. The 75-millimeter gun recoiled. The round missed, short by 30 yards. Miller adjusted elevation, fired again, hit. The round struck the Panzer's front glacis plate. Armor held. No penetration. The Panzer was hull down, only the turret and upper hull exposed. Difficult target. The German Panzer fired back, 75 millimeter. The round passed between Chen's tank and the tank to his left. Close enough that Chen felt the shock wave. The round impacted 200 yards behind them, exploded in the dirt. Chen's tank maneuvered left, trying to get a flank shot. The Panzer tracked with them. The 2nd Panzer, positioned 300 yards to the right of the 1st, engaged the American lead tank, Lieutenant Douglas Parker's Sherman. Parker took a hit on the glacis plate. Armor held. Parker returned fire. 3 rounds in rapid succession. 1st round missed. 2nd round missed. 3rd round struck the Panzer's side armor. Penetrated. The Panzer's ammunition cooked off. Orange flame erupted from the turret. The tank brewed up, smoke column rising 300 feet. 1 Panzer destroyed, 1 remaining. But the engagement had lasted 11 minutes. High-intensity combat, engines screaming. Every Sherman in the column was generating maximum heat. Chen checked his Instruments, temperature gauge, driver position. Corporal James Washington called out the reading. Temperature 187 degrees, sir. Chen processed the information. 187 degrees after 11 minutes of combat. That was wrong. Temperature should be 200 degrees, maybe 205. His previous tank always hit 200 within 10 minutes of sustained combat. But 187 degrees was 18 degrees cooler than expected. Washington called again. Sir, temperature's climbing, 190 degrees. Chen acknowledged, focused on the engagement. The remaining panzer was repositioning, trying to get a better angle. Miller tracked it, waited for a clear shot. The panzer exposed its side for 3 seconds while traversing. Miller fired. Hit. Penetrated the side armor. The panzer stopped moving. Smoke poured from the engine compartment. The crew bailed out, ran toward the infantry positions. Both panzers destroyed or disabled. Engagement time, 16 minutes. Chen's column pushed forward. German infantry opened fire with machine guns. The Shermans returned fire with bow machine guns and turret-mounted .50 calibers. Suppressive fire. The infantry positions were dug in, hard to hit. But the sustained fire kept German heads down while the Shermans advanced. Chen's tank reached the German defensive line at 10:03 hours. The infantry retreated, fell back toward secondary positions 2 kilometers north. Harper ordered pursuit. The column accelerated again. Washington called out temperature. 202 degrees, sir. Chen checked his watch, 10:03 hours. They'd been in combat for 16 minutes. Temperature was 202 degrees. That was remarkable. His previous tank would have been at 220 degrees by now, maybe 225. The difference was 23 degrees. 23 degrees that might mean survival instead of seizure. But Chen didn't understand why. Didn't know about the modification, attributed it to good maintenance, quality control. Maybe this engine was just better than the last one. He focused on the mission. Plenty of time to wonder about temperature readings after they got back to base. The column continued northeast. 1000 hours to 1200 hours. 2 hours of sustained operations. The tactical situation demanded constant movement. German forces kept falling back, establishing new defensive positions. Harper's orders were clear. Maintain pressure. Don't let them consolidate. Keep pushing. Standard doctrine said, halt every 90 minutes for engine cooling. But halting meant giving Germans time to dig in, time to bring up reinforcements, time to establish anti-tank gun positions. Tactical necessity over road maintenance protocol. The column kept moving. By 10:30 hours, signs of stress appeared in other tanks. Tank 714, commanded by Lieutenant Marcus Thompson, reported high temperature. 226 degrees. Thompson's driver reduced speed, dropped from 20 miles per hour to 15, trying to reduce engine load. Temperature climbed anyway. 228 degrees at 10:37 hours. 230 degrees at 10:43 hours. Tank 522, commanded by Sergeant Paul Rodriguez, reported worse numbers. 231 degrees at 10:48 hours. Rodriguez's driver, Corporal Eddie Martinez, reported engine roughness. Unusual vibration, sign of gasket failure. Temperature kept climbing. 233 degrees, 235. Harper was monitoring the radio net, heard the temperature reports, made tactical calculations. 2 tanks showing critical temperatures. Battalion couldn't afford to lose them. But stopping meant exposing the entire column. Germans had anti-tank guns positioned somewhere ahead. Stationary tanks were dead tanks. Harper ordered the column to continue. Accepted the risk. Better to lose 2 tanks to mechanical failure than 12 tanks to German guns. Tank 522 seized at 11:32 hours. Engine catastrophic failure. Martinez felt the engine shudder, heard metal grinding. Temperature was 237 degrees. The pistons seized. Connecting rod broke, punched through the cylinder block. Engine oil sprayed across the compartment. The tank coasted forward on momentum for 60 feet. Stopped. Rodriguez ordered immediate evacuation. The crew bailed out within 20 seconds. All 5 men clear. They ran toward cover. Olive Grove, 200 yards west. German artillery observers spotted the stationary tank. Called fire mission. 3 rounds. High explosive. All landed within 50 yards. The 3rd round hit tank 522 directly. Turret. Penetrated. Ammunition exploded. The tank was total loss. 1 crew member wounded. Rodriguez's gunner took shrapnel in his left leg. Superficial wound. The other 4 were uninjured. They reached the Olive Grove. Waited while the column continued ahead. Another Sherman would recover them on the return trip. Tank 714 held on longer. Thompson reduced speed to 12 miles per hour. Temperature stabilized at 234 degrees. Not dropping, but not climbing. The engine was at its absolute limit. 1 degree hotter would mean seizure. Thompson nursed it forward. Careful throttle control. Minimum speed to maintain formation. At 12:13 hours, tank 714 seized. Temperature hit 236 degrees, same pattern as Rodriguez's tank. Piston seizure. Connecting rod failure. Thompson's crew evacuated successfully. No casualties. But another Sherman was dead. Another $69,000 loss. Another tow job back to maintenance. Another engine replacement that would take 3 days in the depot. 2 tanks lost to overheating in 41 minutes. Expected losses based on July statistics. Nothing unusual. Standard pattern. The 3rd Armored Division was bleeding equipment at predictable rates. But Chen's tank kept running. Washington called temperature readings every 15 minutes. 1100 hours, 207 degrees. 11:15, 209 degrees. 11:30, 211 degrees. 11:45, 213 degrees. 1200 hours, 213 degrees. 2 hours of sustained combat operations. Temperature had peaked at 213 degrees, was holding steady, no climbing, no engine roughness, no vibration. The cooling system was keeping pace with heat generation. Chen noticed. Hard not to notice when 2 other tanks had just seized. Washington noticed. Miller noticed. The whole crew noticed. Something was different about Tank 327. Something that kept temperatures 23 degrees cooler than they should be. Washington spoke over the intercom. "Sir, something's different about this tank." Chen acknowledged. "What do you mean?" "Temperature's been steady for 2 hours, sir. Never seen that in Sicily. Every tank I've driven hits 225 degrees after 90 minutes. We're at 213 after 120 minutes. Miller added his observation. "My last tank seized after 96 minutes during the Palermo operation, sir. We're past that. Still running fine." Chen didn't have an explanation. Attributed it to luck. Good maintenance, quality engine, but privately he wondered. The temperature difference was too consistent to be random. 20 degrees below normal. Exactly 20 degrees. Like someone had recalibrated the cooling system. The column reached Enna outskirts at 12:43 hours. Encountered heavy German resistance. 3 Panzer Mark IV tanks, 2 Sturmgeschütz self-propelled guns, dug-in infantry with anti-tank weapons, prepared defensive positions. This was going to be a real fight. Harper ordered combat deployment. All 12 remaining tanks spread into assault formation. Chen's tank moved to the left flank. The engagement began at 12:48 hours. Sustained combat for the next 47 minutes. High-intensity action, constant maneuvering, maximum engine output. Chen's tank fired 18 rounds, scored 5 hits, 3 confirmed kills, 1 Panzer Mark IV destroyed at 700 yards, 1 Sturmgeschütz destroyed at 500 yards, 1 infantry position neutralized at 300 yards. The German position collapsed at 13:35 hours. Remaining panzers withdrew. Infantry retreated. American column held the field. Cost: 2 tanks seized earlier, 1 tank damaged by German fire, 4 wounded crew members. But the mission objective was achieved. Enna outskirts secured. German defensive positions identified and neutralized. Harper ordered withdrawal at 13:30 hours. Return to base. Mission complete. The column formed up for the return trip. 10 operational tanks. Chen's tank in the formation. Engine still running. Temperature gauge showing 213 degrees. 3 hours of sustained combat operations. Peak temperature 213 degrees. Normal peak would be 238 degrees, 25-degree difference. That difference meant Chen's tank was still operational, while 2 others had seized. The return trip was slower. Reduced speed, 15 miles per hour, conservation mode. Every commander was watching temperature gauges. Nobody wanted to seize during withdrawal. German forces were still in the area. Stopping meant vulnerability. Chen's engine temperature dropped during the return, lower throttle setting, reduced heat generation. By 1400 hours, temperature was 199 degrees. By 1430, 193 degrees. By 1500 hours, 187 degrees. The engine was recovering, cooling properly. The system was working exactly as designed. Except it was working 23 degrees better than factory specifications said it should. The column reached base at 1542 hours. Total operation duration, 9 hours 27 minutes. Total engine run time, 8 hours 53 minutes. Longest continuous operation without cooling halt in battalion history. Chen's tank had operated longer than any other Sherman in Sicily without mandatory cooling stops. Harper noted it in his after-action report. Tank 327 demonstrated exceptional engine performance. Sustained operations for 8 hours, 53 minutes, without cooling halt. No mechanical issues. Temperature remained within acceptable range throughout mission. Recommend investigating what factors contributed to superior performance. But Harper didn't investigate closely. He had other priorities: mission reports, casualty reports, ammunition expenditure, tactical analysis. 1 tank performing well was good news, not a problem requiring immediate attention. Chen dismounted from his tank at 1558 hours. His crew followed. All 5 men exhausted. 9 hours of combat, heat, stress, adrenaline crash. They walked to the debriefing area, reported to Harper, standard after-action interview. What happened? What worked? What didn't? Enemy positions, enemy strength, friendly casualties. Chen mentioned the temperature performance, said his tank ran cooler than expected. Harper acknowledged, made a note, moved on to the next crew. After debriefing, Chen walked to the maintenance area. Found Kovacs working on another tank. Kovacs was holding a hacksaw, metal shavings on the ground around his feet. His hands were wrapped in bloody rags. He looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days. Kovacs saw Chen approaching, put down the hacksaw, waited. This was the moment. Either Chen would report the modification or he wouldn't. Either Kovacs would face court-martial or he'd get tacit approval to continue. Everything depended on what Chen said next. Chen stopped 3 feet from Kovacs, looked at him directly, spoke quietly. Not shouting distance. Nobody else could hear. Sergeant Kovacs, something's different about my tank. Kovacs kept his expression neutral. Different how, sir? Temperature stayed low all day, 20 degrees below normal. Never exceeded 213 degrees. Engines running well. Best performance I've seen. 9 hours continuous operation. My last tank would have seized in 90 minutes under those conditions. Kovacs nodded, said nothing, waited to see where Chen was going. Chen continued. I saw the cowling, saw the ventilation slots, saw the mesh screening. I know factory equipment when I see it, sir. That's not factory equipment. Silence. 5 seconds, 10 seconds. Kovacs could hear his own heartbeat, could feel sweat running down his back despite the evening cooling. This was the end. Chen was going to report him. Court-martial, prison, dishonorable discharge. Chen spoke again. I don't care about regulations. I care about my crew. That modification saved 5 lives today. 522 seized, 714 seized. Rodriguez's gunner got wounded. Thompson lost his tank. My crew came home safe because our engine didn't quit. Another pause. Chen looked around, made sure nobody was listening, stepped closer, spoke even more quietly. How many other tanks can you modify? Kovacs processed the question. Not a threat. An authorization. Unofficial, unspoken, but real. Every tank in the battalion, sir, if you authorize it. Chen shook his head. I can't authorize field modifications. I'm a lieutenant. I don't have that authority. But I can ignore what I don't see. And I don't see anything unusual about my tank's cowling. As far as I'm concerned, it's factory equipment. Chen started to walk away, stopped after 10 paces, turned back, looked at Kovacs one more time. 327 has maintenance priority. Whatever it needs. Whatever modifications you think are necessary. Understood? Understood, sir. Chen walked away, headed toward the officer's tent, didn't look back. Kovacs stood alone in the maintenance area. The sun was setting, orange light across the Sicilian hills. He looked at the hacksaw in his hand, looked at the 11 other tanks waiting for modification, made his decision. He picked up the salvaged cowling he'd been cutting, started working on the ventilation slots, had 3 slots finished, 3 more to go. If he worked through the night, he could have 2 more tanks ready by morning, 4 tanks by the day after, 8 tanks by the end of the week. Chen had given him unofficial authorization, tactical approval. The kind of approval that wouldn't appear in any official report, but meant everything in terms of actual operations. One lieutenant couldn't authorize modifications, but one lieutenant could choose not to see unauthorized modifications, could choose to report superior engine performance without investigating why. That was enough. Kovacs kept cutting. Metal shavings fell. His hands hurt. His back ached. He'd been working for 19 hours straight. But he kept cutting. Because somewhere out there, other tank crews were preparing for tomorrow's missions. Other engines would heat to critical temperatures. Other crews would face the choice between stopping and dying or continuing and seizing. And Kovacs had a hacksaw and a solution that worked. 23 degrees. That was all it took. 23 degrees between life and death. Between seizure and survival. Between regulations and results. He finished the 6th slot at 2200 hours, started installing the wire mesh screening. By midnight, the 2nd modified cowling was complete. By 0200 hours, it was installed on Lieutenant Marcus Thompson's tank. Thompson had lost his previous tank to overheating that morning. His new tank would have better cooling, would have 23 degrees of margin, would have a chance to survive what his last tank couldn't. Kovacs worked through the night, started cutting the 3rd cowling at 0230 hours. The blade was getting dull. He'd have to find a new one tomorrow. But for now, this blade had a few more cuts left. A few more ventilation slots. A few more modifications that violated regulations but saved lives. The mathematics were simple. One hacksaw, 40 minutes per tank, 23 degrees per modification. How many lives could be saved before someone official noticed? Before someone reported the unauthorized work? Before Kovacs faced the court-martial that regulations demanded? He didn't know. But he'd find out. One tank at a time, one modification at a time, one crew at a time, because Chen had proven the modification worked. And proving it worked meant Kovacs had to keep going. Had to modify every tank he could reach, had to save every crew he could save, even if it meant prison, even if it meant disgrace. The mathematics of conscience were clear. Regulations versus lives. Authorization versus action. Prison versus corpses. Kovacs chose action, chose lives, chose the hacksaw and the wire mesh and the 23 degrees that made the difference. Dawn would come in 4 hours. He had work to do. Chen's crew talked, couldn't help themselves. 9 hours of combat without overheating was remarkable. They told other crews in the mess tent that evening, told them about 327's performance, about temperatures that stayed 20 degrees below normal, about an engine that didn't quit when it should have. Word spread through the battalion by morning. July 24th. Whispered conversations. Maintenance area. Barracks. Officers' mess. Everyone had seen 522 and 714Cs yesterday. Everyone knew Chen's tank had operated the entire mission without problems. Lieutenant Marcus Thompson approached his crew chief, Sergeant Michael O'Brien, July 25th. Thompson had lost his previous tank to overheating. His new tank was scheduled for operations July 27th. He didn't want to lose another one. O'Brien, heard Chen's tank ran 9 hours without overheating. O'Brien nodded. Yes, sir. Heard the same. Something different about 327's cooling. Find out what. O'Brien found Kovacs in the maintenance area that afternoon. Kovacs was working on another cowling. 4th modification. The hacksaw blade was dull. His hands were wrapped in bloody bandages. He looked exhausted. Kovacs, Thompson wants to know about Chen's tank. What's different? Kovacs stopped cutting, looked at O'Brien, sergeant to sergeant, both maintenance chiefs, both responsible for keeping crews alive, both knew the regulations, both knew what overheating had done to the battalion. Kovacs made a decision, showed O'Brien the modified cowling, explained the ventilation slots, the wire mesh, the airflow calculations, the 23-degree temperature reduction. O'Brien studied the modification, ran his fingers along the slots, checked the mesh installation, asked technical questions. Kovacs answered them all, showed him the calculations in his notebook, explained why it worked. How long to install? 40 minutes per tank. You got authorization? No. Court-martial offense? Yes. O'Brien was quiet for 30 seconds. Then he picked up Kovacs' hacksaw, tested the blade, put it down, looked at Kovacs directly. Show me how. They worked together that night. Modified Thompson's tank by midnight. Started on another tank at 0100 hours. Finished at 0230. 2 more tanks ready for operations. 2 more crews with 23 degrees of margin. By July 26th, 6 tanks were modified. O'Brien had recruited another maintenance sergeant, Sergeant Paul Henderson from 3rd Platoon. Henderson had lost 3 tanks to overheating in June. He didn't ask about authorization, just asked how to cut the slots. July 27th, 13 tanks modified. Word continued spreading. Tank commanders started asking their crew chiefs about the cooling modification. Most crew chiefs refused. Against regulations. Too risky. But some agreed. Some had watched too many crews die. Some had signed off on too many maintenance logs for tanks that later seized and killed their crews. The modifications spread tank by tank. Mechanic to mechanic, No official documentation, no engineering approval, just hacksaws and wire mesh and 40 minutes of work per tank. Just 23 degrees that made the difference between engines that seized and engines that survived. Company Commander Captain James Mitchell noticed the pattern July 28th. Called Kovacs to headquarters. Kovacs expected arrest, expected court-martial, expected prison. Mitchell looked at him across the desk, studied him for a long moment. 3rd Armored is losing tanks to overheating every day. Your modifications could save lives. But they're unauthorized. If I acknowledge them officially, I have to report them. If I report them, you face court-martial. Silence. Mitchell continued. So I'm not acknowledging them. I'm not seeing them. As far as I'm concerned, nothing unusual is happening in my maintenance area. Mitchell looked at the maintenance roster on his desk. I need every tank mission ready by August 1st. Whatever it takes. Dismissed. Kovacs understood. Unofficial authorization, tactical approval. Continue, but stay quiet. Save lives, but don't create paperwork. Mitchell couldn't officially approve violations of Army regulations. But he could choose not to see what he wasn't looking for.